Without me, you're worthless. And so is that child.
Your wife fell down the stairs. Mr. Holloway, that is the story you are going with. In a penthouse with marble floors and no staircase, Sarah Whitfield married one of the most powerful men in New York and spent 3 years learning what that power actually looked like behind closed doors. When she found evidence of his financial crimes and went to the FBI, she thought the law would protect her. It did not protect her body. On the night Grant Holloway put his pregnant ex-wife in a coma, he believed he had silenced the only person who could destroy him. He did not know about the dead man's switch, the sealed legal package that would activate if she failed to check in every 48 hours. He did not know about Dominic Marchetti, the man whose name made powerful people nervous and whose reasons for protecting Sarah went deeper than anyone in that hospital understood. And he did not know that the woman who had engineered the entire thing, the woman sleeping in his bed and whispering in his ear, had put those FBI documents exactly where he would find them, knowing exactly what he would do next. The fluorescent lights at Mount Sinai did what fluorescent lights always do in emergency rooms. They made everything too bright and too flat at the same time, stripping away the possibility that anything happening under them could be mistaken for normal life. Sarah Whitfield arrived at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in late June, 7 months pregnant, unconscious. The paramedics logged a closed head injury, 2 fractured ribs on the left side, and bruising across both forearms in the pattern that emergency room doctors recognize immediately and are trained to document without editorializing, the kind of bruising that comes from raising your arms to protect your face. Grant Holloway arrived 4 minutes after the ambulance. He was wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he was doing something with his face that a person who did not know him might have mistaken for concern. He told the intake nurse his wife had fallen. He told the first responding officer the same thing. He used the word accident 3 times in his initial statement, which is 2 more times than a person telling the truth usually needs to use it. Detective Maria Vasquez from the 19th Precinct arrived at 12:30. She was 46, had spent 14 years in domestic violence cases, and she carried with her the particular exhaustion of a woman who has heard every version of every lie a man can tell about how a woman ended up on a hospital gurney. She read the paramedic report. She noted the bruising pattern. She looked at the intake form, where it said the patient resided in the penthouse unit of a building on East 72nd Street. She looked at Grant Holloway, who was sitting in the waiting area with his legs crossed and his phone in his hand, scrolling through something with the casual focus of a man waiting for a car service rather than a man whose pregnant wife was being evaluated for brain swelling. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "you told the officer your wife fell down the stairs. That is correct. Your residence is listed as the penthouse at 72 and Park." "Yes, I have been in that building, Mr. Holloway. The penthouse unit is a single-level layout. There is no interior staircase." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not panic. Recalculation. The micro-expression of a man who is used to having his version of events accepted without examination and has just encountered someone who examines things for a living. "The terrace steps," he said smoothly. "There are 3 steps leading down to the terrace." She lost her balance. She has been having difficulty with her balance throughout the pregnancy. Vasquez wrote that down. She did not believe it. But belief and evidence are different currencies in the legal system, and she did not yet have enough of the second kind to do what she wanted to do, which was to arrest Grant Holloway on the spot and let him experience what the holding cells at the 19th Precinct look like under their own set of fluorescent lights. Grant's attorney arrived 20 minutes later. His name was Philip Kessler, and he was the kind of lawyer who bills $1,100 an hour and earns every penny of it by knowing exactly when to stop a conversation. He stopped this one. Vasquez left with her notes and the specific, familiar frustration of a detective who knows what happened and cannot yet prove it to the standard the system requires. Grant Holloway sat in the waiting room and waited for someone to tell him his wife was stable, because stable meant she had not spoken to anyone, and that was the only medical update he actually cared about. 6 miles south, in a restaurant on a street in Carroll Gardens that smelled like garlic and old wood and 30 years of family dinners, Dominic Marchetti was closing out the register. The restaurant was called Lucia's, after his mother. It had been open since 1989, the year Dominic was born, and it occupied the ground floor of a brownstone his family had owned for 3 generations. The dining room seated 44. The kitchen was too small. The wine list was short and very good. It was the kind of place where regulars did not need to order because the staff already knew, and where first-time visitors were treated with the warmth of people who understand that feeding someone is an intimate act, whether you know their name or not. Dominic was not what people expected when they heard the name Marchetti. The name carried weight in certain parts of New York, the kind of weight that had nothing to do with restaurants and everything to do with a family history. That included things no one discussed at dinner and everyone understood. His grandfather, Enzo Marchetti, had built something in Brooklyn in the 1960s that was not entirely legal and not entirely illegal, and was, by the time it reached Dominic's father, large enough to require a decision about what the next generation was going to do with it. Dominic had made his decision at 19, the year his brother Marco was killed, not by the police, not by a rival, by a situation that had escalated because no one in the room had the sense to de-escalate it, and Marco, who was 23, and still believed that loyalty to the family business meant showing up for every meeting, regardless of what was on the agenda, had shown up for the wrong one. Dominic had spent the next 20 years building something different: real estate, shipping, logistics, 3 restaurants, a construction firm, all legitimate, all profitable, all carrying the Marchetti name in a way that was meant to prove the name could mean something other than what it had meant before. But he had kept the network, not the operations, not the revenue streams, not the part of the old business that involved things he would not do. The network, the people who knew people, the infrastructure of relationships that his grandfather had built and his father had maintained, and that Dominic had preserved the way a person preserves a fire extinguisher, not because they plan to use it, because they understand that some situations require tools that cannot be purchased at retail. His phone rang at 12:15. He did not recognize the number. He answered anyway, because he was the kind of person who answered calls, a habit his business partners found inefficient and his mother found reassuring. "Mr. Marchetti, my name is David Chen. I am Sarah Whitfield's attorney." Dominic set down the stack of receipts he had been sorting. "Ms. Whitfield gave me your name and number 8 months ago," Chen continued. "She told me that if anything happened to her, if she was unable to communicate for any reason, I was to contact you immediately. She was specific about that. She said you would understand. What happened? She is at Mount Sinai. She was brought in approximately 40 minutes ago. Head trauma. She is unconscious. She is 7 months pregnant. Her husband told the police she fell." Dominic was quiet for 3 seconds. 3 seconds is a long time when someone has just told you that a woman you care about is in a hospital with a head injury and a story that does not add up. "She did not fall," Dominic said. "No," David Chen said. "She did not." Dominic locked the register, turned off the lights, and was in his car before the call ended. The drive from Carroll Gardens to the Upper East Side takes 35 minutes at that hour if you obey the speed limits. Dominic made it in 22. He knew Sarah Whitfield. He had met her 2 years earlier at a fundraising event for a legal aid organization she ran on the Lower East Side. The organization provided free legal representation to domestic violence survivors. Sarah had built it from a one-room office and a personal credit card into something that employed 11 attorneys and had a waiting list. She ran it the way certain people run things, with total commitment and no interest in whether anyone was watching. Dominic had written a check that night, a large one, not because he was the gala type, but because he had listened to her speak for 4 minutes about what it means to be trapped in a situation you cannot leave, and he had recognized something in the way she talked about it that went beyond professional commitment. She was not describing other people's lives. She was describing a thing she understood from somewhere closer than case files. They had seen each other periodically after that, fundraising meetings, a coffee near her office once, a dinner that was technically professional but lasted 3 hours and covered territory that professional dinners do not usually cover, including his brother, her marriage, and the specific loneliness of being someone who other people perceive as strong. He had never acted on what he felt. She was married. She was dealing with something inside that marriage that he could see, but she had not named, and he had understood, without needing to be told, that naming it for her would have been a violation of the same principle he had built his entire adult life around. You do not make decisions for other people, regardless of how clearly you can see the decision they need to make. But she had given his name to her attorney 8 months ago, before the pregnancy had advanced this far. She had been preparing for something, which meant she had known her situation was dangerous enough to require a contingency plan, and she had put him in it. He arrived at Mount Sinai and found the emergency department in the controlled chaos that emergency departments maintain at all hours. He told the intake desk he was there for Sarah Whitfield. They told him only family was allowed. He said he was family. He said it with enough certainty that the nurse did not ask a follow-up question. He found her room. He stood in the doorway. She was lying on her back with her eyes closed and a tube in her arm and monitors tracking her vitals in steady green lines. Her face was swollen on the left side, the skin discolored in the specific purple-yellow gradient that comes from a blow, not a fall. Her arms were above the blanket, and the bruising there was visible and legible, the defensive marks of someone who had tried to protect herself and had been overmatched. She was 7 months pregnant, and the fetal monitor beside the bed showed a heartbeat that was steady and strong, and completely unaware of anything that had happened to its mother. Dominic pulled a chair to the side of her bed and sat down. He had seen violence before. He had grown up around men who used it as a tool and women who absorbed it as a cost. He had watched his mother navigate 30 years of marriage to a man whose temper was legendary in 2 boroughs, and he had formed his opinion about men who hit women long before he was old enough to articulate it. David Chen arrived 20 minutes later. He was a small man with wire-rimmed glasses and the demeanor of someone who processes urgency by becoming calmer. "I need to explain something to you," Chen said. He closed the door. "Whitfield came to me 14 months ago. At that time, she had discovered irregularities in the financial records of Holloway Pacific Group, transactions that did not correspond to any legitimate business activity. She spent 2 months documenting them on her own before she contacted me, and I referred her to a colleague at the Department of Justice." He paused. "She has been cooperating with a federal investigation into Grant Holloway's financial activities for approximately 4 months. Wire fraud, market manipulation, bribery of a federal housing official. The case is substantial. Her evidence is comprehensive. She was the government's primary cooperating witness. Grant found out, Dominic said. That is what we believe. But the circumstances of how he found out are not clear to me yet, and they should be, because Ms. Whitfield was extraordinarily careful. She kept all documentation with my office. She did not bring materials home. She did not discuss the investigation with anyone, including me, including you. She believed that the fewer people who knew, the safer everyone would be. Chen adjusted his glasses. She was wrong about that, and I think she knew she might be wrong, which is why she put your name on the contingency protocol. What protocol? Chen opened his briefcase. 8 months ago, Miss Whitfield instructed me to assemble a sealed evidentiary package, a complete copy of every document, recording, and financial record she had compiled. The package is held in a secure off-site facility, with instructions to transmit its contents to the Department of Justice, the SEC, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Reuters if Ms. Whitfield fails to check in with a coded confirmation every 48 hours. Dominic looked at Sarah lying in the bed, with monitors tracking her vital signs and a fetal heartbeat pulsing on the screen. How long since her last check-in? Approximately 40 hours. She checked in Sunday evening. She is due again by tomorrow night. If she does not check in by then, the package transmits automatically. Can you check in for her? No. The system requires a code that only she knows. It was designed that way intentionally. She did not want anyone, including me, to be able to stop it once it started. Dominic sat with that. The woman lying in this hospital bed, beaten unconscious by a man who thought he was silencing her, had built a weapon that activated precisely because she was silenced. The worse Grant hurt her, the more certain her evidence became. There is one more thing, Chen said. He lowered his voice. A woman arrived at the emergency department approximately 10 minutes before you did. She identified herself as a colleague of Mr. Holloway's. She asked the intake nurse 3 questions: whether Ms. Whitfield was conscious, whether she had spoken to anyone, and whether she had an attorney of record. Who was she? Her name is Lydia Kane. She is the chief financial officer of Holloway Pacific Group. 3 questions. Not the questions a concerned colleague asks. The questions a person asks when they need to know whether a specific piece of information has been communicated. Why does the CFO of Grant's company care whether Sarah has spoken to anyone? That, Chen said, is the question I have been asking myself since I arrived. The monitor beeped, steady and mechanical. The fetal heartbeat held its rhythm, strong and unaware, and already fighting for something it did not yet know it needed to fight for. Dominic leaned forward. He looked at Sarah's face, bruised and swollen and still carrying, even in unconsciousness, the architecture of the woman he had watched command a room full of donors and lawyers, with nothing but the clarity of what she believed in. I am going to find out who did this, he said quietly. Not to Chen, not to Sarah exactly, to the room, to the specific quality of a promise made in a hospital at 1 in the morning when the person you are making it to cannot hear you, and I am going to make sure they answer for every single mark on her. He reached for his phone, not to call a lawyer, not to call the police. He called a number that was not saved under any name in his contacts, a number he had memorized 15 years ago and had used fewer than a dozen times since, each time for a situation where the conventional tools were not sufficient and the unconventional ones were necessary. The phone rang once. It is Dominic, he said. I need everything you can find on a man named Grant Holloway and a woman named Lydia Kane. I need it by morning. He hung up and sat back in the chair, outside the window. Manhattan did what it always does at 1 in the morning. The city moved in its million simultaneous directions. Indifferent to what was happening in this room, the 48-hour clock was running, and somewhere in a penthouse on East 72nd Street, Grant Holloway was pouring himself a drink and believing, with the confidence of a man who has never been held accountable for anything, that the worst part of his evening was over. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about it in ways he could not yet imagine. Dominic did not sleep that night. He sat in the chair beside Sarah's bed until 4 a.m, then drove back to Brooklyn, showered, changed, and started making calls. The first call was to a man named Victor Salinas. Victor had worked for the Marchetti family in various capacities for 23 years, starting as a driver for Dominic's father and evolving, through competence and discretion, into something that did not have an official title but functioned as a combination of investigator, fixer, and institutional memory. He knew people in every borough. He knew people in law enforcement, in city government, in the hospital system, in the building management companies that ran the luxury residential towers on the Upper East Side. "I need 2 things, Dominic said. The security footage from 72 and Park, the full building system, every camera, every entrance, the entire night starting at 6 p.m. I need it before it disappears. And I need the medical records from Mount Sinai, the full intake report, the imaging, the physician's notes. The building footage will be requested by the police," Victor said. "The police will request it through official channels, which means a subpoena, which means a judge, which means Grant's lawyers will know about it before the ink is dry, and the footage will develop a technical malfunction. I need it before any of that happens. The building has a facilities manager named Paul Kerrigan. He has a sister who works at one of our construction sites in Red Hook. Start there." The second call was to his attorney, a woman named Rachel Torres, who had represented Marchetti business interests for 12 years and who possessed the rare combination of legal brilliance and complete immunity to intimidation. She had once told a federal prosecutor in open court that his case was held together with tape and wishful thinking. She had been correct. The case had been dismissed. "I need everything public on Grant Holloway's financial structure," Dominic told her. "Corporate filings, SEC disclosures, real estate holdings, every subsidiary and shell entity connected to Holloway Pacific Group. You are involving yourself in a domestic violence case involving a billionaire CEO," Rachel said. "I want to make sure you understand what that means for you, specifically, given your name and your history. I understand exactly what it means." "Good. Then I will have the corporate filing analysis by end of day." The third call was to his mother. Angela Marchetti was 71 and lived in the same brownstone above the restaurant where she had raised 2 sons and buried a husband and developed, over the decades, an understanding of the world that was simultaneously compassionate and ruthlessly practical. She answered on the first ring because she always answered on the first ring. "There is a woman in the hospital," he said. "Sarah, I have mentioned her before, the one with the legal aid organization, the one you talk about differently than you talk about anyone else." Angela Marchetti was not a woman who required things to be stated explicitly. "What happened?" Her husband. Angela was quiet for 4 seconds. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to go to Mount Sinai today. Sit with her. She does not have family in the city right now. Her parents are in Vermont. I do not want her alone in that room. I will be there by 9. No questions about whether this was wise, whether the Marchetti name in a hospital room would create complications. Angela Marchetti had spent 30 years married to a man whose business occasionally required decisions that the legal system would not have endorsed, and she had formed her own moral framework independently of his. The framework was simple. You do not leave people alone when they are hurt. Everything else is negotiable. By 8 o'clock that morning, Dominic had 4 people working the problem. Victor was pursuing the building footage and medical records. Rachel was mapping Grant's corporate structure. A second investigator, a woman named Janet Park, who had spent 9 years at the FBI before going private, was building a timeline of the evening, and the fourth person was someone he had not spoken to in 3 years, a man who operated in spaces that Dominic had deliberately left behind but had not entirely forgotten. This man did not investigate. He did not file motions. He applied a different kind of pressure, the kind that comes from being present in places where the target does not expect to be watched, the kind that a man like Grant Holloway, who had spent his entire life believing he was insulated from consequence, would recognize at a visceral level, even if he could not articulate what had changed. At 9:15 that morning, the first piece of Grant's counter-strategy went live. The story appeared on page 6 of the New York Post. The headline was carefully constructed. It did not say Grant Holloway assaulted his wife. It said that an unnamed source close to the family had described a domestic disturbance involving a woman with a history of emotional volatility, a difficult pregnancy, and what the source characterized as a pattern of erratic behavior that had concerned family members for months. By 10 o'clock, a second story appeared on a financial news site that had historically been friendly to Holloway Pacific Group. The word misunderstanding appeared twice. The phrase sources close to the family appeared 3 times. This was not Grant. Grant was a blunt instrument. This was someone who understood media architecture, who had relationships with editors, who knew how to place a story at the exact publication that would give it the right kind of credibility. This was Harrison Holloway. Harrison Holloway was 74 years old and had been running things, in one form or another, for 50 years. He had founded Holloway Pacific Group in 1978 with money that came from sources he had spent the subsequent decades carefully laundering into respectability. He had built the company into a real estate and financial services empire valued at just under $9 billion. And he was, beneath the philanthropy and the boards and the carefully maintained public profile, a man who had been managing his son's problems for Grant's entire adult life. A Dewey at 22, settled quietly. A sexual harassment complaint at 28, settled with enough money and legal pressure to make the complaint and the complainant disappear. A pattern of behavior that Harrison had observed and contained and never once addressed, because addressing it would have required acknowledging that the son he had built the company for was fundamentally damaged. He was not a schemer or a puppet master. He was something in some ways worse. He was a tired old man who had known, for years, that his son was capable of exactly what had happened Tuesday night, and who had chosen, every single time the evidence presented itself, to manage the situation rather than confront it. At 10:30 that morning, Harrison called his son. "The media placement is running," Harrison said. "We are building the frame. Difficult pregnancy, emotional instability, a woman under tremendous strain who may have injured herself during a period of psychological distress." "She did not injure herself," Grant said. "That is not the relevant question. The relevant question is what a jury believes 12 months from now. We are building the narrative. She was cooperating with the FBI. Father, she had documents. She had been building a case for months." Harrison was quiet for 5 seconds. "What kind of documents?" "Financial records, transaction histories, shell entity filings. She found the HUD payments. She found the Maze connection." The silence had the quality of a man reassessing the structural integrity of everything he had built. "Where are the documents now?" "I do not know. They were on her desk. I saw them Tuesday night." "That is when—" He stopped. "That is when you lost control of yourself and put your pregnant wife in a hospital, creating the single most damaging piece of evidence against this family that has existed in 30 years of exposure management." Harrison's voice was ice. "We have survived SEC inquiries. We have survived audit committees. And now you have given them a victim. a pregnant victim with bruises on her face and a story that writes itself in every courtroom in this country. I will handle this, Harrison said. I have handled everything else. But you will do exactly as I tell you, starting now, without improvisation. Do you understand? Yes, stay home. Do not speak to anyone. Do not contact her. The media team will handle the public narrative. Legal will handle the police. And I will handle the problem. The problem, Sarah, the woman his son had married and controlled, and finally beaten into a hospital bed. Harrison Holloway called her the problem and hung up the phone and went back to the work of making her disappear from the narrative. Dominic drove to the hospital at noon. He stopped on the way at a flower stand on Montague Street in Brooklyn Heights, a small sidewalk stand run by a woman named Delia, who had been selling flowers on that block for 15 years. He bought wildflowers, not roses, not the architectural arrangements that arrived at hospital rooms in glass vases with cards from people who sent flowers as a reflex. Wildflowers, purple and yellow and white, wrapped in brown paper, the kind Sarah had used at the Legal Aid Gala the year before, scattered in mason jars on the reception tables, because she thought formal flower arrangements made people feel like they were at a performance rather than a conversation. He had noticed that. He had noticed and he had remembered. Angela was in the room when he arrived. She was sitting in the chair beside Sarah's bed, knitting something small and yellow. The nurse asked if I was her mother. Angela said. I told her yes. She did not check. Anyone else been here? A woman came to the door around 10:30, blonde, expensive coat. She looked into the room but did not come in. When she saw me, she left. Lydia Kane, again, checking again. Not the behavior of a concerned colleague, the behavior of someone monitoring a situation. Dominic set the wildflowers in a plastic cup he filled with water from the bathroom sink and placed them on the table beside Sarah's bed. A nurse came in to check the IV line. Are you her husband? She asked Dominic. He looked at Sarah, at the bruises on her face that her husband had put there. No, he said. I am the person who should have been here sooner. At 1:45, Dominic found Lydia Kane in the hallway near the nurse's station, speaking to someone on her phone in a low, practiced voice. She ended the call when she saw him. Mr. Marchetti, she said. She extended her hand. Lydia Kane, I am the CFO of Holloway Pacific. I came to check on Sarah. We are all devastated by what happened. What did happen? Dominic asked. A terrible accident. Grant is beside himself. Has she spoken to anyone? Lydia asked. Her attorney, for instance. David Chen. I just want to make sure she has all the support she needs. The question landed with the precision of a thrown dart. Not how is she? Not when will she wake up? Has she spoken to her attorney? By name. She has not spoken to anyone, Dominic said. She is in a coma. Of course. If there is anything the company can do to support her, please do not hesitate. She smiled. It was a good smile. There was nothing in it you could point to and say that is false. But there was nothing in it you could point to and say that is real either. She left. Dominic watched her walk to the elevator. He went back to Sarah's room and thought about what Lydia had just done. She had asked about David Chen by name. Why does the CFO of Grant's company need to know whether Sarah's lawyer has been in contact? His phone buzzed. Victor, I have the building footage. Grant Holloway arrives at 8:47 p.m., enters the penthouse at 8:51. At 9:18, he calls for an ambulance, but at 6:30 p.m., approximately 2 hours before Grant arrived, another person entered the penthouse using a separate access card registered to Holloway Pacific Group, a woman, inside for approximately 21 minutes. She left at 6:51. Describe her. Blonde, mid-30s, expensive coat. Lydia Kane had been in the apartment 2 hours before Grant came home. At 4 o'clock, the monitors shifted. Sarah's eyelids moved, not the random fluttering of unconsciousness, but the deliberate movement of a person trying to surface from somewhere deep. Her fingers moved on the blanket. Her left hand opened and closed once. Her eyes opened. They did not open easily. They opened the way a door opens when something heavy has been pushed against it, slowly, with resistance. She saw the ceiling first, then the monitors, then the IV line, then Dominic. Her eyes focused on him with a clarity that was startling, not confused, not disoriented. The eyes of a woman who had surfaced from unconsciousness and was immediately assessing her situation. "The clock," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "The documents. How long?" "Approximately 40 hours since your last check-in. You have roughly 8 hours before it transmits automatically." "My office." "The legal aid office on Delancey. Bottom drawer, left side. There is a sealed envelope taped to the underside of the drawer. The backup code is inside." Dominic called Victor. Victor made it in 17 minutes. The envelope was in Dominic's hands by 4:35. She dialed a number from memory on Dominic's phone. "Confirmation Alpha," she said, "and read the code one character at a time," her voice shaking but precise. Timer reset. 48 hours from now. "You stopped it," he said. "I paused it. There is a difference. I do not want it to auto-release. I need to control when those documents go out and in what order. I want to control the detonation. I want to choose the moment and the method and the sequence. And I want to make sure that when it goes off, it takes down not just Grant, but everyone who built the structure that protected him. Everyone meaning his father, and her, Lydia Kane. She is not just sleeping with him. She is running him. She has been running him for at least a year. She is the smartest person in every room Grant has ever walked into, and Grant does not know that. She suggests, she supports, and every suggestion moves Grant one step closer to a decision that benefits Lydia and damages Grant. I do not believe Grant found those FBI documents on his own. I was too careful. Someone put those documents where Grant would find them. Lydia was in the apartment 2 hours before Grant got home, Dominic said. The building footage shows her entering at 6:30 and leaving at 6:51. She put the documents on my desk. She knew he would come home. She knew he would see them. She knew what he would do. She set him up. She lit the match and put it in his hand, and she was not even in the building when the fire started, because Grant is in her way. She wants Holloway Pacific, not Grant, the company. If Grant goes to prison, the board needs a new CEO, and there she will be. I need to tell you everything, she said, and then I need you to help me finish this. Not by protecting me, not by making decisions for me, by helping me do what I already started. She reached for his hand. Can you do that? Yes, I can do that. Close the door. The first thing I need to tell you about is not Grant. It is Lydia, because Lydia is the one we have to be afraid of. Grant is a hammer. Lydia is the architect, and the architect is the one who decides which walls come down. And on the 38th floor of a glass tower in Midtown, Lydia Kane was sitting at her desk, reading the Page 6 article she had helped Harrison plant that morning, smiling, because everything, from her perspective, was going exactly according to plan. She did not know about the building footage. She did not know about the dead man's switch. She did not know that Sarah was awake. She would learn all of these things, but not until the moment Sarah chose. The next 48 hours moved in two directions at once. On the surface, the story was the one Harrison Holloway's media contacts were telling. Underneath, it was a war conducted in phone calls and encrypted files and quiet meetings, and Sarah Whitfield was running it from a hospital bed with 2 fractured ribs and a bruise on her face that was turning from purple to the greenish yellow of healing. She was remarkable. Dominic had known capable people his entire life, but Sarah operated on a different frequency. She was in pain, She was exhausted. She was processing the physical trauma of what Grant had done to her while simultaneously managing a federal investigation, a media war, a 48-hour countdown timer, and the growing certainty that the woman who had engineered her assault was still operating freely. She started with what she knew. Over the course of their 3-year marriage, Sarah had watched Grant operate with the casual confidence of a man who believed his wealth insulated him from rules that governed other people. The first year had been good, genuinely good. Grant was attentive and generous and present in a way that felt like the whole of him rather than a performance. The second year was when the edges started showing. Small decisions made without consulting her, a gradual reorientation of their social life toward people Grant found useful, away from people Sarah cared about. The third year was when she found the first anomaly, a quarterly summary for a housing development in Queens that had received federal funding. The numbers did not match. Construction costs reported to HUD were 30% higher than the internal project files. The difference had been routed through a subsidiary that existed on paper but had no employees, no office, and no function. She had spent 2 quiet months pulling threads: wire fraud, market manipulation, bribery. She had taken it to David Chen. David had taken it to the DOJ. And for 4 months, Sarah had been the government's cooperating witness. Harder than this, she told Dominic, gesturing at the monitors and her own broken body. This is just pain. That was pretending. Every day, sitting across from him at dinner, knowing what I knew. That was the part that almost broke me. Why did you not leave? Because leaving would have tipped him off. His lawyers would have found the cooperation agreement. The whole case would have collapsed. So I stayed. And I smiled. 3 more weeks. That was all I needed. Someone put documents in the apartment that I never brought home. There are only 3 people who knew about the cooperation. Me, David, and the assistant U.S. attorney. I trust them both. Which means someone found out through a different channel. Lydia is the CFO. She has access to every financial system in the company. If she noticed the same anomalies I noticed, she would have known someone was pulling records. If Lydia knew about the investigation and she knew Grant well enough to predict his reaction, Dominic said, then she designed the outcome. She wanted me removed, and she wanted Grant to be the one who did it. She gets the company and gets rid of 2 problems at once. That afternoon, Dominic went to see Grant Holloway. He did not call ahead. He drove to the Holloway Pacific building on 53rd and Park and took the elevator to the 38th floor. He was escorted to a conference room on the 36th floor. Grant arrived 7 minutes later. I do not know you, Grant said. You know my name. I know your family name. I know what it means. If you are here to threaten me, my security team and my legal team are both very good at their jobs. I am not here to threaten you. I am here to tell you what I know. You came home at 8:47. You went upstairs at 8:51. At 9:18, you called for an ambulance. In those 27 minutes, you assaulted your wife. You hit her in the face. You fractured 2 of her ribs. You did this while she was 7 months pregnant. She fell, Grant said. She did not fall. The bruising pattern on her arms is defensive. The injury to her face is consistent with a direct blow. You told the police she fell downstairs that do not exist. One more thing, Dominic said at the door. The FBI cooperation materials. You told your attorney you found them on her desk, right there in the open. Sarah Whitfield never brought federal documents home, not once. So, the question you should be asking yourself is not how she got those documents into your apartment. The question is who put them there, and why. That evening, Dominic returned to the hospital. Sarah had been working. David's investigator pulled the access logs, she said. Lydia Kane accessed the same files I accessed, the same subsidiary documentation. She accessed them 3 months before I did. She knew before anyone. She found the fraud before I found the fraud, and she did not report it. She waited for someone else to discover it, and when I did, she used my cooperation as a weapon against me. She is brilliant. Dominic, she found the fraud, identified me as the whistleblower, placed the FBI documents in my home, knowing Grant would react with violence, and positioned herself to inherit everything. She left one fingerprint. Dominic said, the building footage. Victor pulled it. 2 encrypted drives in 2 separate locations. His phone buzzed. Victor, the detective assigned to Sarah's case, Carl Brewer, submitted a report stating the building footage contained no anomalous activity. Brewer has a brokerage account that received $40,000 6 weeks ago from a source connected to Holloway Pacific, a bought detective. Dominic told Sarah. She was not surprised. Of course he is. Grant has been buying people for 20 years. His father taught him. A detective who files the wrong report. A journalist who writes the right story. One favor at a time. If the police investigation is compromised, we go around them. We build the case ourselves and deliver it directly to the federal prosecutors. Margaret Reeves at the DOJ. She is outside Grant's reach. But first, I need Grant to tell someone what really happened, not the version for the police, the real version. Lydia. Grant will tell Lydia. He tells her everything, and she will store every word as leverage. Then we take it from her, by making her so afraid of what we already have that she trades it voluntarily for freedom. Why are you doing this? Sarah asked. You do not owe me anything. My brother was 23, Dominic said. He walked into a room he should not have walked into. Nobody warned him. I knew something was wrong, and I did not say it loud enough. I have spent 20 years trying to fix that. When David Chen called me, I was not going to make the same choice twice. She reached out and took his hand. She laced her fingers through his and held on. Not briefly. They stayed like that in a hospital room at night with the city outside and the monitors beeping. Thank you, she said, not the automatic kind. The kind that comes when a person who has been carrying something alone feels the weight shift. And on East 72nd Street, Grant Holloway was on the phone with Lydia Kane, telling her exactly what had happened Tuesday night. Every detail, every blow. I did not mean for it to go that far, he said. I saw the documents and something broke. She was standing there, and she looked at me like she was disappointed, like I was small. That made it worse. You were protecting yourself, Lydia said. Her voice held exactly the right amount of sympathy. Anyone would have felt threatened. I hit her, Lydia. She is 7 months pregnant, and I hit her. You reacted. There is a difference. There was no difference. Lydia knew that. But the purpose of the conversation was capture, and she captured every word. Janet Park lived in a walk-up in Park Slope. Carl Brewer is not freelancing, she said. He is part of a network. 2 detectives and a desk sergeant at the 19th precinct. The payments traced through a shell company called Whitmore Consulting, connected to Holloway Pacific Group, just under $200,000 distributed to 3 officers. She showed Dominic text messages between Brewer and an unknown number from the night of the assault. Package at Sinai. Standard protocol. Keep it quiet. And Stair's story is thin. Build the supplemental around the terrace angle. Make it stick. Someone told Brewer to build the cover story before he even arrived at the hospital. The language matches internal Holloway Pacific security terminology. Someone inside the company sent those messages. At the hospital, Sarah had more. Lydia accessed the Holloway Pacific document system 14 times in the 3 weeks before the assault. On the afternoon before, she accessed scanned copies of my FBI cooperation agreement through Margaret Reeves's personal cloud backup. She printed them from her workstation at 4:11 p.m. She entered the apartment at 6:30. She left at 6:51. Grant came home at 8:47. By 9:18, I was in an ambulance. I have the full chain. She engineered it. Now it is time, Sarah said. She released the dead man's switch in a controlled sequence. DOJ first, SEC second, media hold for 24 hours. And Lydia, not yet. If we hit them both at once. Lydia flips. She walks on to the DOJ and offers everything about Grant for immunity. She walks away clean. No consequences for engineering the assault. Grant goes first. Grant goes publicly. Lydia watches and believes she is safe. Then I close the door behind her. She called Margaret Reeves at the DOJ. They spoke for 40 minutes. We will move on this, Reeves said. She called her parents in Vermont. Her father, a civil rights attorney for 35 years, got on the line. Your father is very proud of you. What you are doing right now is the reason I became a lawyer, she cried after that call. Dominic stood in the hallway and did not go in, because some moments belong only to the person having them. When she opened the door, she said, "Coffee. You promised me real coffee. I am still waiting." They drank coffee and talked about the baby's name. James, she said, after my father. He spent 35 years defending people nobody else would defend. I want my son to carry that name. At 9 o'clock that morning, 6 federal agents arrived at the Holloway Pacific headquarters. They walked through the front doors of the building with the Holloway name in brass above the entrance. Grant Holloway, said Special Agent Sandra Okonkwo. You are under arrest for wire fraud, securities manipulation, and bribery of a federal official. This is a mistake, Grant said. Please step around the desk. Sir, the handcuffs closed. They walked him through the 38th floor, past conference rooms, past executives pretending to look at screens, past the receptionist with her hand over her mouth. 2 junior analysts in the elevator pressed themselves against the wall. One dropped her coffee. Outside, the media was already there. 3 camera crews, a photographer, and on a monitor inside a news van, a split screen. On the left, his arrest. Liv. On the right, a photograph of Sarah from the Legal Aid Gala 2 years ago, standing at a podium, smiling, just barely showing the pregnancy. Grant stopped walking. He was not looking at the cameras. He was looking at her face on the monitor. And he remembered the Sunday morning in January when she told him she was pregnant. She had looked up at him, scared and hopeful and vulnerable. He had held her. For 30 seconds he had been real, not performing. Just there, with her, he understood now, standing on a sidewalk in handcuffs, that those 30 seconds might have been the last time he was real. Everything after was the performance. And the performance had cost him the only person who had ever seen something in him worth loving. In a hospital room, Dominic and Sarah watched the arrest together. When it was over, Sarah said, I thought I would feel more. Victory, relief. Instead I feel tired and sad and glad it is over, all at the same time. He reached for her hand on the blanket. They sat like that for a while. On the 38th floor, Lydia Kane entered Grant's office 4 minutes after the agents left. She sat in his chair. She called a board member and expressed her willingness to step into an interim leadership role. Her phone buzzed. A photograph of herself entering the residential lobby at 6:30 p.m. on the night of the assault. Below it, we know you were there. We know what you did, and we have everything. The smile faded from her face. Her eyes changed. She set the phone down and stared at the city that, 30 seconds ago, she had believed was about to become hers. In his cell downtown, Grant sat with his hands flat on the metal table, the same hands that had signed deals, the same hands that had held his wife on a Sunday morning, the same hands that had done the thing that ended everything. His father had not answered the phone. The silence on the other end was the loudest thing in the room. He put his forehead against the cold metal and felt, for the first time, the full weight of a thing he could not manage or buy his way out of. Lydia lasted 41 hours. The call came at 2 in the morning. I want to talk, she said. Not to me, Dominic said. To her. You are going to come to this hospital and sit in a room with Sarah Whitfield, 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, room 412. If you are not there, the next conversation you have will be with federal agents. That is not how this works, Lydia said. It is now. She will come, Sarah said. She needs to see me. She cannot make the calculation without that data. Lydia walked into a conference room at Mount Sinai at 9 o'clock. Sarah was in a wheelchair. She had insisted on it rather than the bed, because she understood that the physical arrangement of a confrontation communicates before anyone opens their mouth. She was not going to have this conversation lying down. Before we begin, Lydia said, I want to be clear that I have information valuable to your case. I am prepared to cooperate fully in exchange for immunity from prosecution. You bought a burner phone 3 days before you put those documents on my desk, Sarah said. You texted Detective Brewer at 11:52 that night. Package at Sinai. Standard protocol. You had the cover story ready before Grant walked through the door. You had the detective ready. You planned every piece of it. You accessed the FBI cooperation agreement through Margaret Reeves's cloud backup, downloaded it at 2:17 p.m., printed it at 4:11, entered my apartment at 6:30, left at 6:51. You were 3 miles away when he found what you left for him. You knew what he would do. You knew because you spent a year studying him. You knew his temper. You knew that when Grant feels cornered, he responds with violence. You weaponized it. You engineered a violent assault on a pregnant woman as a business strategy. You do not have enough to convict me, Lydia said. The access logs are circumstantial. The building footage proves I was there. Not what I did. Your attorney does not know about the printer Q log, Sarah said, or the text messages using internal Holloway Pacific security language, or that Detective Brewer, who resigned 48 hours ago, is currently describing every instruction he received from you to federal prosecutors. Brewer is talking, Lydia said. Not a question, a recalculation. You are going to provide a complete sworn statement, Sarah said. The documents, the burner phone, the text messages, Grant's confession, Harrison's media operation, all of it, and in exchange, I will recommend that your cooperation be taken into account during sentencing. I will not recommend immunity. You engineered a violent assault on a pregnant woman, and you do not get to walk away from that clean. That is not a deal. That is a conviction with a footnote. Yes, it is, and it is the best thing you are going to be offered today, because the alternative is that Brewer's testimony goes forward without yours. And when a jury hears that a CFO engineered an assault on the CEO's pregnant wife as part of a corporate takeover strategy, they are not going to be thinking about footnotes. Lydia looked at Sarah for a long moment. Then she said, I will make the statement. Her voice was flat, emptied. She stood and walked to the door. She turned and looked at Sarah one last time with the recognition of a person who has just learned something about herself she cannot unlearn. She had been outmaneuvered by a woman in a wheelchair with broken ribs and a baby on the way. 2 weeks later, a story appeared in the Post. Mafia Princess. Dominic's family history laid out. The suggestion that Sarah had traded one dangerous man for another. Dominic drove to the hospital. He sat across the room, by the door. I should step back, he said. My name is going to become a weapon against you. Come here, she said. He did not move. Dominic, come here. He walked across the 12 feet and sat beside her. You do not get to make this decision for me, she said. That is what Grant did. Every day for 3 years. He decided what was good for me. Now you are doing the same thing, deciding your name is too heavy for me. I am not afraid of your name. I am not afraid of a newspaper article. I have spent 3 years being afraid of one man, and he is in a federal holding cell. and I am done being afraid. The truth is that you showed up. That is not a scandal. That is a fact. And facts survive. Stay, not because I need you to, because I want you to. There is a difference. I am staying, he said. She lifted his hand to her face and held it against her cheek and closed her eyes. He turned his palm so it rested against her skin. I am going to kiss you now, she said. Not because the timing is right, because the timing is terrible, but because I have been wanting to since the night you brought wildflowers to a hospital room in a plastic cup, and I am done waiting. She kissed him, carefully, because of the ribs, briefly, because of the monitors and the nurse coming in 4 minutes, but completely. The kind of kiss that is about arrival. Two people who had been moving toward each other through damage and danger and loneliness, who had finally closed the distance. Terrible timing, she said. The worst, he said. Later, 3 weeks later. Federal agents arrived at Harrison Holloway's estate in Greenwich. The house was built in 1893 and communicated permanence. Harrison was in his study, drinking tea, reading the Financial Times. Agent Okonkwo read the charges: bribery, obstruction, wire fraud, conspiracy. Harrison looked at an old photograph on his desk. A young man in his 30s standing in front of a small building with a sign that read Holloway Development. No Pacific, no group, just a beginning. He picked up the photograph, held it, and set it face down on the desk. I would like to call my attorney, he said. They walked him past the rose garden, past the groundskeeper standing with his hat in his hands, past the brass nameplate at the gate that read Holloway. Sarah was discharged on a Saturday. Dominic took her to an apartment in Brooklyn Heights. Quiet, tall windows, a view of the Brooklyn Bridge. The second bedroom had been painted yellow, a crib, a rocking chair, and wildflowers on the dresser. She stood in the doorway and cried, not the brief kind, the kind that comes when a person who has been clenching every muscle finally lets go. She came out after 5 minutes. You remembered the flowers, she said. I remember most things about you. I just did not know with that until recently. She put her hand on his chest. Slow, she said. Slow, he said, but not as slow as before. James Whitfield Marchetti was born on a Thursday evening in early October. 7 pounds 2 ounces. He has your chin, Sarah said. He does not have my chin. He is 20 minutes old. He has your chin and my stubbornness, and we are both in trouble. In a federal facility that same evening, Grant Holloway was holding a sonogram David Chen had sent through his attorney. He thought about the Sunday morning, the kitchen, the tea, the look on her face. He thought about the last time she cooked, a Wednesday. Humming something while the water boiled, she had turned and smiled the real smile, and he had felt something crack because some part of him knew he was losing her. He put the photograph on the shelf beside his bed and lay in the dark. The lights went out at 10. He thought about a kitchen and a song he could no longer remember the name of. 3 months later, on a Sunday afternoon, Dominic sat on the floor with James on a blanket beside him. Sarah came out of the bedroom. Grant's plea deal was on the table. 12 years. I do not feel triumph, she said. It feels like waste. I want James to grow up, knowing that power means something other than what the Holloways thought it meant, that the strongest thing a person can do is tell the truth when it costs something. Can you do that? Yes, I can do that. Sarah leaned against Dominic's shoulder. He put his arm around her. They sat on the floor with a baby between them and the afternoon light coming through the windows. This is where it ended. Not with a courtroom, with a Sunday afternoon and a baby on a blanket, and 2 people who had found each other inside the wreckage of something terrible and decided to build something instead. Sarah did not set out to bring down a dynasty. She set out to protect her son. Dominic did not set out to fall in love. He set out to answer a phone call because The last time he did not move fast enough. His brother died, and James, who had no say in any of it, was lying on a blanket looking at the ceiling, learning that the world is large and strange and full of light, and the people holding you are not going to let go. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was a start.